This lecture is called George Herbert for Pastors by myself, Andy Rowell. George Herbert lived from 1593 to 1633. There are a number of versions you can read of his work. There's a new cover from 2005 of the Penguin Classics there on the left, and an older cover from 1992. And then there is also published by Penguin, another Penguin Classics version, but it has a different title called The Complete Poetry. It's edited by John Drury and Victoria Moule. And there's another one called The Complete English Works, also by Penguin. And that one has an introduction by Slater. The previous ones that I mentioned have a introduction by John Tobin. All right. I don't think you want to read the free public domain versions that are online because they have the kind of older English spelling, and I think you'll appreciate the updated spelling. In these versions, most of them, they have a biography by Isaac Walton called Isaac Walton's Life, or The Life of Mr. George Herbert. It was published originally in 1670, 37 years after Herbert's death. Walton also was a biographer of some other people, including John Donne, who was a person who is friends with George Herbert's mother. A little bit about George Herbert's biography from not just Walton, but some other sources. He was from a prominent, well-known family who was in relationship, as I said, with John Donne. Shakespeare dedicated his original works to some of their relatives. George was the seventh of 10 children. His father died when he was 3. He was educated at Cambridge at age 23. The year he started his master's at Cambridge, Shakespeare died. That gives you a little bit of an idea of the time when he lived. He held positions at Cambridge for 9 years after, from ages 25 to 34, including public orator, which meant he wrote things for the university on behalf of the university in Latin, that sort of thing. He was in relationship with the king at the time. He was often sick. He was a parliament member for a year. He then became a prebend or canon in a village near Spalding from ages 33 to 34, and he helped repair a church building there. He had been a deacon before that, but he still wasn't a priest or ordained at that time yet. He had a close friend from Cambridge who lived in a Christian community at Little Gidding, who T.S. Eliot mentions Little Gidding later in his work in the 20th century. Nicholas Farrar, very interesting, just the whole idea of living in community and praying constantly with a group of about 30, which was kind of an inspiring, pious example for Herbert. Herbert ended up getting married at age 35 after knowing the woman just for 3 days, but they had been introduced and had heard a lot about one another and had kind of been set up for a long time. From age 36 to 39, he was a priest or parson. Then he did get ordained as a priest at Bemerton. He also rebuilt the church building of that, I think. He died at age 39. I write here like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King Jr. as well. And then on his deathbed, he had not had his poems published. He gave them or had somebody bring them to his friend Nicholas Farrar to do whatever with them, and then they were published. T.S. Eliot thinks that one reason why Herbert's poetry is so powerful is he was brilliant, but he did not use all of those talents for public service. He did to some extent in politics, but he chose to really serve a small church and be a priest. And so, in a way, he poured his energies, his talents into poetry, reflecting on that calling, and to do it really well. It was not seen as a prestigious or powerful or great role to be a parson, or especially a country parson. So Eliot writes this, Herbert's principal temptation was ambition. Herbert's weakness became the source of his greatest power, for the result was the temple, this set of poems. The Temple was published at his death, as I mentioned, in 1633. He begins the Temple with a little bit about poetry. He says, rhyme thee to good and make a bait of pleasure. So what he's saying there is you can, with art, with a great lyric, a great that can grab somebody's attention, bring them in, and then a verse may find him who a sermon flies and turn delight into a sacrifice. That means a verse may, reach someone who a sermon would miss. A sermon would not hit the person, and turn delight into a sacrifice. Turn their realization, their joy in understanding the poem, that could actually have a positive influence in their life. Poetry also is something where you really see somebody laboring over it, the poet, of trying to say something precisely. It also slows down a reader. I think for me, if his poems were about 200 pages total, I feel like it took me about 200 days to read it, like about a half a year to kind of work through these poems, because I could only digest a page or so, at one sitting. So they force you to slow down. They remind me a little bit of working through like the Psalms. Or Proverbs as well, where you can kind of only take reading a small portion, but it's really good for you to read that small portion. Just a couple comments from T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden, who are known as some of the most important Christian poets of the 20th century. T.S. Eliot writes, if there is another example besides Herbert since his time of a poetic genius so dedicated to God, it is that of Gerard Manley Hopkins. And W.H. Auden said his poetry is the counterpart of Jeremy Taylor's prose. Together, they are the finest expressions we have of Anglican piety at its best. And in their two books where they talk about George Herbert, they each wrote a book, one Eliot in 1962 and Auden in 1973. They, as fellow poets, really praise his technical skill, Herbert's amazing technical skill, as well as, though, in these quotes, really the content. Eliot admires, the piety, the dedication to God, and Auden as well. That's some of the richness, is the just wholesomeness and the Christian content of the poetry. The church porch. This is a little bit about, there's the beginning of the temple, and it's the porch. It's sort of like your beginning. It's the introduction. You first get on the porch, and then later we'll get into the church, where almost all the poems are. But the church porch is kind of the introduction to the temple, and it's a little bit different. The Perrier Hantarium. The Perrier Hantarium is a poem. It's a set of proverbs that is in the church porch. And I think pastors actually would really enjoy it. People who love proverbs. Perrier Hantarium means sprinkler in Greek, and so maybe it's like getting baptized, or it's like a introduction or a cleaning before you kind of get into the church or something like that. I'm not exactly sure, but I do know the content of what that poem is all about, and it's long. It took me a while to get through it. But again, this is almost like taking somebody from the world into better habits, wise ways to live. So I just give you a little bit here on this slide, a little bit of kind of highlights. Right at the beginning, lust distorts Bible reading. Either be single and pure or marry in section 3. Be careful of alcohol access from sections 5 through 8. Lying produces more problems. Be diligent in 14 to 16. Use humor well from 39 to 42. Friendship in 46. And then from 63 to 77, kind of at the end, give, tithe, fast, pray, and attend church. And even, try to get something out of the sermons, even if it's not a great sermon. There's some interesting stuff right there at the end. But this is really thought-provoking on how to live well from Herbert. So I just invite you to work through that. If you're patient enough, if you can penetrate it, it's really rich. I really enjoyed, writing in the margin the proverb or the idea that I got out of what he was writing. All right. All right. The church is the main portion of the temple after the church porch of, George Herbert's poems. And I'm just going to go through a few of these poems and just give you a little bit of a taster on understanding them and getting into them. All right, so affliction. And I think what this one's about is he was initially excited about serving the Lord, but he admits and confesses that he has been fickle and wants to quit after all the trouble that he has been through. It's like a psalm. And it has this line, when first thou didst entice to thee my heart, I thought the service brave. And so what he's saying is when you first enticed me to serve, I thought it was going to be great. I really did. And then things unravel. All right, another poem. Prayer. So you can see in parentheses, he has a number of prayers, a number of poems called prayer, but this one's number 1. And it's really just different descriptions of prayer. So it's a bit different from some of his other poems, but here's a line here. God's breath in man returning to this birth. The soul in paraphrase, heart in pilgrimage. So these are just like 3 different descriptions of prayer. God into Adam, breathed into human beings breath. And so now when we pray, we're breathing back to God. Yeah, get it? And then the soul in paraphrase. So we're trying to paraphrase our soul to God. Or the heart in pilgrimage, like, what's on our heart, what's going on with us, where we are journeying, talking to God about that. So that's great. To read some of those. Reverse Thunder is another one. That's the name of a Eugene Peterson book that he gets from this. Jordan, 1. And I sort of said about this is kind of that phrase, why does the devil have all the good music, art about bad subject matter? So he's reflecting on poetry and art. And have you ever thought about that with movies? Why are all the movies about kind of bad subjects? Why can't there be good movies or about good things? And he says this at the beginning of this poem. Who says that fictions only and false hair become a verse? Is there in truth no beauty? So he's saying there that, why does it have to be, people in wigs that we write poetry about it? What about, writing poetry about truth? Couldn't that be beautiful as well, rather than just, things that, are false? Like a person in a wig, why would we just write about those things and other fantasies or fictions? All right, next poem. The Windows, and this one is about preaching. And he writes, Lord, how can man preach thy eternal word? He is a brittle, crazy glass. And what he's picturing here is like a stained glass window. And he says that a preacher is like God's word coming through, shining through like the sunshine, beams of light through a window, and yet it's not clear. So the person who's a preacher, they're like brittle, crazy glass, and so the beam is shining through them, but it's not always clear. So he writes, Lord, how can man preach thy eternal word? He is a brittle, crazy glass, yet in thy temple thou dost him afford this glorious and transcendent place to be a window through thy grace. So I sometimes think of that phrase. I read it in Haddon Robinson's preaching book a long time ago, but preaching is truth through personality or something like that. But this idea that God can speak through the distortion even of we preachers in our imperfections. All right, the next poem. Trinity Sunday. This poem just has really great rhythm and rhyme. You could memorize it and really pray it. So, for example, this is not at the beginning of it. Enrich my heart, mouth, hands in me, with faith, with hope, with charity, that I may run, rise, rest with thee. So anyway, that's just a great, in other words, change me, Lord, my heart, my mouth, my hands, put in my heart, my mouth and hands, put faith, hope, and charity and love, faith, hope, and love, that I may run, rise, rest with thee. A great prayer. Submission. This is a poem. It's kind of about a desire for ambition that George Herbert has. And he writes this to God. Were it not better to bestow some place and power on me? Then should thy praises with me grow and share in my degree. He says, God, why don't you give me fame and power and I'll share with you. Then you'll be glorified. Anyway, it's just a great little prayer to God. And you'll see more of how that develops in the poem. Misery, another poem here. Humanity's plight is his plight. And he writes, Lord, let the angels praise thy name. Man is a foolish thing, a foolish thing. Folly and sin play all his game. His house still burns, and yet he still doth sing. Man is but grass, he knows it, fill the glass. And that last part just seems like almost a toast, or you can imagine, I guess, people drinking in a pub or a bar or club or something, and just doing toasts and clinking the glasses together, and just say, it's almost him doing a toast here. He says, people are such a mess. Why don't you just have God, angels praise your name? because human beings are a lost cause. They're just a mess, and man is messed up. We know it. Let's drink to that. And so, it's sort of lament about the plight of humanity. And then he says, I'm like this too. I'm a mess. So I think you'll enjoy reading that one. Jordan 2, we already read Jordan 1, but this one's about extravagant writing and preaching and poetry as compared with simple communication. After Herbert's first sermon at Bemerton, he told his congregation, according to Walton, that his expressions would be more plain and practical in his future sermons. That his opening one was kind of a lot of flourishes, and he would be more clear and straightforward from that point on. Maybe he felt like he kind of lost them in that first extravagant sermon, that he had tried to kind of pour too much into it. And so in this poem, it reminded me of that. He says, when first my lines of heavenly joys made mention, such was their luster, they did so excel. Then I sought out quaint words and trim invention. My thoughts began to burnish, sprout, and swell, curling with metaphors a plain intention, decking the sense as if it were to sell. And so what he's saying there, you may be able to see it, is that he's so excited that he writes like these very verbose, exciting words that almost people actually can't follow, because he's just writing with such enthusiasm and detail and metaphors, that it's almost too much, and so he's almost like saying, I'm just selling it. I'm almost going overboard. And so, he has to think about whether that's the right thing to kind of go, to flourish with all these extras, or whether it's better to speak more simply and plainly. The Collar is one of George Herbert's most famous poems. I saw it in a Poetry Out Loud collection. And The Collar, is about being a priest. They wear that kind of white and black kind of collar to signify that they are a pastor or a priest. And so I take the gist of this, at least at the beginning here, that for pastors, I'm out of here. This vocation stinks. I'm discouraged. And it begins this way. I struck the board and cried, no more, I will abroad. And just this idea that maybe he slammed his fist on the pulpit, or just on his desk, or through a wall, I don't know what. But I struck the board and cried, no more. I'm done. I am done. I'm out of here. I'm abroad. I am taking off. I'm getting out of this country. I'm getting away from here. And I think sometimes pastors will resonate with that poem. The Priesthood is another poem about pastoring. And it's got this great line, I am both foul and brittle, much unfit to deal in holy writ. Right? I'm unfit. I'm not good enough. I'm not prepared enough. I have too much sin in order to deal with Holy Scripture. Who am I to be here? And that's the question of that poem. Do I have any business doing this work? The Flower. This is again one that I think T.S. Eliot really likes as well. And I read it through and found it quite beautiful and encouraging as well. This is kind of halfway through the poem, and he's reflecting about how discouraged and the dry times he has had, the winter in his heart, and yet spring has come, and he is able to write. He's able to think. He's able to preach. He's been reborn afresh here. And he says, and now in age, finally, now in age I bud again. After so many deaths I live and write. I once more smell the dew and rain, and relish versing. O my only light, it cannot be that I am he on whom thy tempests fell all night. And so just here, and now in age, like now finally, I'm budding again. The flowers are growing again. I'm a flower. I'm petals, and I'm beautiful again. After so many deaths, now I'm alive again. I live and write. I once more smell the dew and rain, like, the spring, and I can smell and I sense things again. I'm no longer dried up and depressed and that sort of thing. And now I relish verse. I enjoy writing poetry. Oh, my only light. So he's thanking God. You're my only light. It cannot be. It reminds me of the, Wesley, and can it be, it cannot be that I am he. How can it be? I cannot believe it's still me. I'm back, on whom your storms fell all night. I've been through so many storms all night long, and I'm still here. I'm back. All right. The next thing beyond the poetry that will be of real interest to pastors and for people who find poetry hard is a priest of the temple, or the country parson, his character and rule of holy life. This is a prose work that he wrote that was published later, but published after his death, but about pastoring. And so this is like straightforward. This is how he thinks you should pastor. Just a couple comments of summary comments before I get through and share a bunch of details of great insights and interesting insights from a priest to the temple. I would just say that example is really crucial for George Herbert. How does one live well? You see that in the church porch. You see it in the church, the poetry. And then you see it also in a priest of the temple. Results really go unmentioned. He has a high standard. That's why people talk about his piety, means his integrity. He just puts a lot of emphasis on that, but also confessing, his limitations and that sort of thing as well. Also, I'll just say that there's not a harshness in what he does. Like almost always, he talks about being kind, just constantly through his description of pastoring. You just get the image of a sheep or a shepherd who's kind to his sheep. I think there's realism. I think he doesn't say things he doesn't believe. There's sincerity. There's relationality, social intuition, that sort of thing. I think what reminds me too about reading Gregory the Great's the Book of Pastoral Rule, Teresa of Avila's work, is that there's really an emphasis on purity of one's life, of what it means to be good. And I think that's actually quite difficult sometimes to describe or depict. But I think all three of these folks do a really good job of trying to articulate what it means to be, as a Christian, living the good life, a follower of Christ. So I just think it may be difficult for you to get through if you're not a pastor. I don't know exactly. I just know as a pastor, I ate this stuff up. I just thought it was really insightful and encouraging to see this good pastor think about what it means to be a pastor. in the 17th century. So I found it really, really inspiring and rich when I first read it, and then also again as I read it. So I would encourage you, if you're a pastor, I just don't think you could really do better than to read A Priest to the Temple. And I don't know whether you'll understand his poetry, but I do know it's Old English, but it's been updated some in these versions. But I think it's readable. I think you can get through it and understand because it's just straightforward. He's just saying this is what you should do. And I think almost everything, I'm quite sympathetic, does apply to today. I'm happy to chat with people about pushing back on things he says and disagreeing. And there may be things that I disagree with. I think there's probably a little bit of stuff that you disagree with just in terms of his knowledge of medicine. That's probably the thing that sticks out the most. Just that they don't have a whole, that's been something that's advanced. So you see, I guess, a little bit of comments there where I guess I don't buy all of what he says there. But in general, I just think there's so much good and right and on target and insightful about what he writes in A Priest of the Temple. Now I'm going to give you a bunch of examples. All right. Just a comment on Parson. I think the way I've heard this first was in Bing Crosby's Winter Wonderland, which you hear on the radio, or at Christmas time. In the meadow we can build a snowman and pretend that he is Parson Brown. He'll say, "Are you married?" We'll say, "No, man, but you can do the job when you're in town." So anyway, just the idea of Parson Brown, a pastor is a pastor. And there are other things, rector, vicar, dean, that are in the Anglican system in the Church of England, in the UK. But you don't have to know all of that. You can learn about it. You can read about it in Jane Austen's books or in Anthony Trollope's books, or you can look it up. But just for our purposes, he writes about a parson does this, a parson does that. I really think you can just replace that with shepherd, pastor. A priest, I think you can really get an idea of what that's about. You don't need to worry about that word and just think about pastor, or whatever word that makes the most sense to you, whatever you are. If you're a minister, I think that would fit fine. Priest. All right. George Herbert begins A Priest of the Temple with his note to the reader. And it's great. He says, "I've resolved to set down the form and character of a true pastor, that I may have a mark to aim at, which also I will set as high as I can, since he who shoots higher that threatens the moon than he that aims at a tree. Not that I think if a man do not all which is here expressed, he presently sins and displeases God." So what he's saying is, I'm trying to depict an ideal pastor. It's something I'm trying to do. I'm trying to articulate what I want to be like, almost like this is my philosophy of ministry. This is what I want. I'm trying to picture this person as the perfect pastor. That's what I'm trying to depict here and describe. And he says, I think that's kind of what would be helpful, is kind of have that vision. And then if you fall short, that's something you have to work through. But it's good to have in your mind kind of the perfect ideal. So that's how I take it. And he says, if you don't do it exactly like this, I don't know that, you're sinning or displeasing God. I'm just trying to do my best at depicting this. He also writes in the beginning of the church porch something similar in his preface there, where he just says, I hope, God, that this will be useful, and if it's not, may those people not read it who it's not useful for. All right. Again, just a little bit about being an example here. Just some quotes here for him. He really feels like clergymen are not respected. We, in our day, also see scandals among clergy. And he also realized that clergy were not necessarily well thought of. He says, through the iniquity of the late times have made clergymen meanly valued and the sacred name of priest contemptible. Yet I will labor to make it honorable by consecrating all my learning and poor abilities to advance the glory of that God that gave them. So he's going to try to reverse, the bad perceptions people have of clergy. But above all, I will be sure to live well, and this I will do because I know we live in an age that hath more need of good examples than precepts. So rather than good teaching, we really need good examples. And I think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer said that too in his letter from prison about, that's really what's needed in post-Nazi Germany. So anyway, just that idea of the importance of example. And Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from the Birmingham jail also wrote about the power of example. All right. Herbert goes on to write, visible humility and charity in their lives, the lives of pastors, visible humility and charity in their lives, this would be a cure for the wickedness and growing atheism of our age. This and this only that must do it. Until then, the fault must lie at our doors. So he's saying, there are people who doubt Christianity, the existence of God, and probably the best thing is for us to really show humility and love in our lives. That's probably the first thing that needs to happen. All right, I'm just going to go through some of these chapters of in A Priest of the Temple and give you just some insights that I think you should notice that will, I think, be a taster and for why you want to delve into this book. So he says, but after a man is once a minister, he cannot agree to come into any house where he shall not exercise what he is, unless he forsake his plow and look back. So in other words, be courageous, speak up, not kowtow to money. So what he's trying to say is that no matter who you work for, you still are a pastor, and it's to desert your calling if you're not doing not speaking up when you really need to. Now, he's going to say throughout that you should do so really graciously, discreetly, maybe indirectly, but regardless of who you work for, money can't be what influences or fame or fear what you say. All right. Chapter 3 of the Parson's life. A great line here is that he says, because country people live hardly and therefore as feeling their own sweat. So in other words, he's saying they live hardly, like they have a hard life. They live in a hard way. It's kind of a hard life, country people. And therefore as feeling their own sweat, they sweat and consequently know the price of money. So they know the price. They know they're sensitive to money because it's tough. They live a tough life. They, therefore, country people, are offended much with any by hard usage increase their travail. So in other words, if you're making life harder, taking their money away from them, they'll notice. So he says the country parson is very circumspect in avoiding all covetousness, all greediness. So he's just saying you're under the microscope. People are watching how you live, so don't be greedy. Don't fail to be generous. So interesting. Just that I just found it kind of interesting for him to say, look, this is a really important part, is to live in a frugal and a generous way. Then on the next section, he says the parson is also very strict in keeping his word. And he has a similar thing about country people. Notice, if you don't do what you say, they will notice. And I don't think it's just country people on these things. I think it's in any setting. All right. The Parson's Knowledge, chapter 4. He says this. He says first, basically, that you should know about a lot of things. And then he goes into saying Scripture, though, is the most important thing. So let me read about that. The country parson is full of all knowledge. They say it is an ill mason that refuseth any stone. So anyway, somebody who's a bricklayer, they should take any stone that's in front of them, any brick, and use it. And there is no knowledge, but in a skillful hand serves either positively as it is, or else to illustrate some other knowledge. In other words, you can take anything, any object, any brick, and you can use it for good purposes. So it's just good to have broad knowledge because you can use it for good. He condescends even to the knowledge of tillage and pasturage. So the pastor, even like it's kind of beneath him, but he knows like farming, and he knows taking care of animals. He knows about the crops and also animal keeping, and he makes great use of them in teaching, because people, by what they understand, are best led to what they understand not. So I think for us too, just like to understand everyday life of other people, I think it's useful. And I just love that he's saying that can be put to use. But then he goes on, he says, he just says basically people can understand things if you illustrate things from things they already know. And then he says, but the chief and top of his knowledge consists in the book of books, the storehouse and magazine of life and comfort, the Holy Scriptures. There he sucks and lives. So that's where you also need to prioritize in your learning and in your content, is to know the Scriptures. All right, the parson preaching. I like this. He says to tell stories, but then he says also to be serious. So this is great. He says sometimes the parson tells people stories and sayings of others according as his text invites him. So according to the scripture text, maybe there's a story or a saying, phrase that you use. For them also men heed and remember better than exhortation. In other words, people remember stories and sayings better than exhortations, which, even though they're earnest, yet often die with the sermon. So in other words, people forget them, the exhortations, especially with country people, which are thick and heavy and hard to raise to a point of zeal and fervency, and need a mountain of fire to kindle them. So this is funny. I mean, he's just saying, hey, and I think it's not just country people. Normal people are thick and heavy. It's hard to get through to them, and it's hard to get them excited and fervent, to zeal and fervent. You need a mountain of fire to kindle them. You just need a whole lot of enthusiasm or story or sayings or something to get through to them, to get them excited. But he says, but stories and sayings they will well remember. And then he says, the country parson often tells his listeners that sermons are dangerous things, that none goes out of the church as he came in, but either better or worse, that none is careless before his judge, and that the word of God shall judge us. So in other words, he says to people, listen, you're here in church, none of you leave the same. Pay attention, this is important. Will you, take into account these things or not? Choose today who you will serve. That kind of encouragement and exhortation, is that sort of boldness and passion is good. He says, by these and other means, the parson procures attention, but the character of his sermon is holiness. He is not witty or learned or eloquent, but holy. So in other words, the point is to be right. The point is to be scriptural. The point is to say these things matter and to be faithful to the scriptures. That's more important. The holiness, that sense of holiness, the purity, the rightness of what you're saying is more important than being witty or learned or eloquent. And I think some of his poems, which we talked about, are kind of along those lines, where sometimes he gets more excited about the illustrations or the words and forgets kind of the plain truth. And so he kind of chides himself in some of those poems for missing that and not focusing on what's most important. The parson preaching, this is another thing from this section. And it's about, he says, basically you expound a text. That's what you do. You don't do word studies. And you're not to go over an hour in preaching because you will really bore people and put people off. So he says the parson's method in handling of a text, a scripture text, consists of two parts. First, a plain and evident declaration of the meaning of the text. Tell people what the text means. That's the first thing you do. Secondly, some choice observations drawn out of the whole text as it lies entire and unbroken in the scripture itself. In other words, hey, just some comments on the text and how it fits in the context. And then he criticizes some other ways. He says, whereas the other way of crumbling a text into small parts, as the person speaking or spoken to, the subject and object and the like, hath neither in it sweetness nor gravity nor variety, since the words apart are not scripture, but a dictionary, and may be considered alike in all the scriptures. So in other words, he's saying, hey, don't do all kinds of breaking down the text into, a word. This word means this, and this word means that. You're really. He worries about that you're going to lose people by crumbling the text. He says, you're starting to sound like a dictionary rather than talking about the sentences of the text. And then he says, the parson exceeds not an hour in preaching. So don't go over an hour, because all ages have thought everybody has thought that that's a good thing. From all ages, to keep short is a good thing. And you will, if you can't profit, if you can't get through to people in an hour, you'll even lose people and make people angrier after that. And he that profits not in that time will less afterwards. The same affection which made him not profit before, so people's feelings about him before weren't great, making him then weary, and so he grows from not relishing to loathing. So a short sermon, somebody might say, I didn't love it, but if you're way over an hour, people say, I hate this preacher. You're going from somebody just not really liking the sermon to kind of hating you and hating. So, and Walton actually said that Herbert himself kept under 30 minutes under his sermons. All right. The parson's state of life, I think this is a great line. He's talking about meeting all kinds of things about being single or having a wife and children. He says, if he be married, the choice of his wife was made rather by his ear than by his eye. So he's just trying to say, like, the content of the person, the character of them, what you hear when talking with them is more important than just physical attraction. So just a great little line there. If he be married, the choice of his wife was made rather by his ear than by his eye. The parson in his house, chapter 10, his wife, his children, his servants are all, quote, the beginner of good discourses. They're good conversationalists. And he also says in chapter 23, to put men to discourse of that wherein they are the most eminent is the most gainful way of conversation. And then he says earlier in the church porch, he says, entice all neatly to what they know best, for so thou dost thyself and him a pleasure. So just interesting that he says, hey, you, your wife, your children, your servants, all of you, you should be nurturing in them to talk about meaningful, good content, serious topics or something like that. And then they will, when they're with people, they'll do the same. And one of the tips he gives is like, hey, ask people what they really know a lot about, because you'll learn and they will enjoy telling you about it. So kind of some comments about good conversation. All right, more from chapter 10. The furniture of his house, the parson's house, is very plain. He hath no money for such things. And also he goes on, not just talking about furniture should be plain, but luxury is a very visible sin. The parson is very careful to avoid all the kinds thereof. So just simplicity, frugality. Chapter 3, also in the church porch, he says, be thrifty. That was from chapter 3, the luxury comment. From the church porch is the line, be thrifty but not covetous. Chapter 11, the parson's courtesy. This is just an interesting quote from chapter 11, but then I have some from 12, 14, and 20. All of these have this idea that if you see somebody doing something well, piously, good, commendably, help them. Try to just encourage them in that. So he says, yet doth he oftenest invite those whom he sees take best courses. So he says, invite people over to your house to eat. He says, you should invite everybody, but he says, especially those who are diligent, who are doing the right thing, reward them, have them over, spend time with them, encourage them. In chapter 12, he says, giving them most who live best and take most pains and are most charged. So he's talking about giving money or donations to everybody, but especially those who are doing good with it. Similarly, chapter 14, if he finds them reading, he furnishes them with good books. If curing poor people, if he finds them, they're caring for poor people, he tries to help them, give them supplies. He supplies them with receipts and instructs them further in that skill. And then if chapter 20, if he chanced to find any reading in another's borrowed Bible, he provides him one of his own, rewarding all good deeds their full proportion. So in other words, if you see somebody doing something good, just encourage them and help them further in that. All right, the parson's charity. He says, but he gives no set pension to any. The pastor does not encourage overdependence on the church's charity. So he says, you should go around, be caring for people, helping them, maybe doling out charity here or there, but no hey, every month we're giving you that much. He doesn't want them to be dependent on that charity. So just sort of interesting, his thoughtfulness in that. The parson in circuit, chapter 14. I thought it was interesting that he kind of articulated some reasons why people might miss the Lord's Day or be working on the Lord's Day, which might be okay. I just thought it was sort of interesting. He says they shouldn't be doing unnecessarily servile work. They should be keeping the Sabbath on the Lord's Day. But he says, except in the cases of extreme poverty and in the seasons of seed time and harvest. Seed time and harvest reminds me of a line in Great is Thy Faithfulness, seed time and harvest, something like that. But just that idea that, hey, that might be, I'm just noticing his pastoral subtlety, his caring, that he recognizes that in that job of being a farmer, there may be just emergencies. And there's going to be then a little bit of flexing with those people about their Sabbath practice or Lord's Day attendance or something like that at church. Again, he says that you do need to talk to people when you notice things that are problems. But he says, if he be a plain countryman, he reproves him plainly. So somebody who's just kind of a simple person, you just have to kind of be straightforward and just kind of say, no beating about around the bush, just kind of say it to them. But he says, if they be of higher quality, if they're a different kind of person, if they're sensitive, they commonly are quick and sensible and very tender of reproof. And therefore, the parson lays his discourse so that he comes to the point very leisurely, making them to reprove themselves. So in other words, if they're already sensitive, all you have to do is sort of, start talking about the topic maybe a little and kind of round about the topic. And then they will then say, oh, I was so sorry when that happened. They will reprove themselves even. And so you don't need to directly say it to somebody. It's just interesting to see his pastoral subtlety. Chapter 17, the parson in journey. When he comes to his inn, he refuseth not to join. I just thought this was interesting. He hangs out with people. The pastor hangs out with people. When he comes to an inn, pub, hotel, and people are carousing, drinking, he may go in there and chat with people. And so just sort of interesting because he says, hey, this might be a place that I can be a light. The pastor in Sentinel, chapter 18. Again, if it be well spoken or done, he takes occasion to commend and enlarge it. So if he sees something good, he praises it. I just think about that when we go into situations, any sort of situation in the world, and there's things to say that are worthy of praise, that are kind of Christian-like. It's good to encourage it and praise it. But if there's poison, you also should probably warn people and say that. But Herbert says, but the pastor does this discreetly with mollifying and suppling words. So in other words, gently, in a way that a mollifying means not trying to upset people. And suppling means kind of softening, soft words, softening people towards the topic. Even though it's a poison, you want to warn them gently. The person catechizing, he says to do on Sunday afternoons after you've already preached a sermon. That was the practice then. But this has to do with like going to families or individuals and talking with them, kind of question and answer sort of things, where you're actually dialoguing with them in smaller groups where there's back and forth. And he says it's not enough really for somebody to like memorize the right doctrines or the catechism by rote as parrots, he says, without ever piercing into the sense of it. They don't understand it. They're just parroting back. Rather, he says, use questions. And so he says, questions is an admirable way of teaching, wherein the catechized, the person, the student, will at length find delight, and by which the teacher, the catechizer, if he once get the skill of it, will draw out of ignorant and silly souls even the dark and deep points of religion. Socrates did thus in philosophy. So in other words, even silly people, if you ask good questions, you'll get them into like profound, thinking about religion and philosophy, like Socrates did. But he says, just question and answer, that position will not hold in Christianity because content is needed. So in other words, maybe Socrates believed that, hey, if you just ask people enough questions, they'll come to the right truths. But he says, no, you actually need content in Christianity. People need to learn some things. And again, just he says about questioning, he says, when one is asked a question, a person gets asked a question, he must discover what he is. So that it like puts him on the spot and it makes him think when somebody's asked a question. This practice exceeds even sermons in teaching. So when you ask somebody a question and let them think about it and you do kind of back and forth, it really gives them pause. It makes them really think. And it may do more good than even a sermon in terms of helping them to really think. A little bit about object lessons. He talks about this a number of times, that using common objects is a way to teach. He says, in illustrating the thing by something else which he knows, making what he knows to serve him in that which he knows not. So in other words, for him, it was like farming or, animals. Well, let's learn about this. That's sort of similar to that. And then he says, the things of ordinary use are not only to serve in the way of drudgery, but to be washed and cleansed and serve for lights, even of heavenly truth. So you can use common objects for object lessons or teach from normal everyday affairs. And he says, Jesus used parables, by familiar things. Jesus might make his doctrine slip the more easily into the hearts even of the meanest. Retrieval and elaboration, those are things in educational psychology, having people, recall what they know about this. And then once they know something, have them like talk through, what they know about that, elaboration. And then that gets them into further understanding of something. Also about catechizing. He talks a little bit then about sermons after he just said that sermons don't do as good a job as teaching and asking questions on some things. He says the thing that sermons do is that the one informing, the other inflaming. For questions cannot inflame or ravish or grip people. that must be done by a set and labored and continued speech. So sermons do have something that questions don't. They inspire people. They really grab people, and they also give some good content, some informing. So those are things that if you just use the question and answer is not going to work. The parson and sacraments, I thought this was interesting that he said on First Communion or young people taking communion, he says the time of everyone's first receiving is not so much by years as by understanding. So in other words, there's not a set age when it's the right time for them to take their first communion. He says children and youth are usually deferred too long under the pretense of devotion to the sacrament. People are trying to protect the sacredness of communion or Eucharist or Lord's Supper, but it is for want of instruction. They just haven't been instructed. He says, they're usually put off too long. He says their understandings being ripe enough for ill things, why not then for better? So he says they understand all sorts of things. I sometimes think about that too, with kids understand Pokemon cards or something. Can't they understand communion? Just other kind of, elaborate things that they've memorized, but can they not also understand Lord's Supper? If they can, maybe they can take the Lord's Supper. He says, the saying of the catechism is necessary, but not enough. So in other words, they need to be able to say the truth about, let's say, for example, about the Lord's Supper, because an answer and form may still admit ignorance, but the questions must be propounded loosely and wildly, and then the answer will discover what he is. In other words, you need to kind of, if somebody's, they can't give just the right answer. You got to give them like a bunch of other kind of questions, even wild questions or loose questions, and then they can sort of see if they really understand or if they just had memorized the line, that they were told to memorize. So, you might say to them, just a wild question like, does the, Lord's Supper symbolize this other thing? And the person would say, no, it doesn't symbolize that. Well, does it, does it symbolize this other thing? And like, no, it's not really, so just kind of wild things like that might be helpful in sort of seeing whether the kid understands. And if they do, then that's great. Let them participate. All right. The pastor's completeness, chapter 33. Yet whenever any controversy is brought to him, he never decides it alone, but sends for 3 or 4 of the ablest of the parish to hear the cause with him. This is just straightforward, but sometimes we think about the pastor and being the decider or being really decisive or wise. But he just says, no. When a controversy is brought to you, get 3 or 4 of the people who know this topic to talk about it with you and work through it. So I think good leadership stuff on collaboration that we know is wise, and we don't need to feel like we need to do it all. Maybe sometimes because of it's private or it's controversial, that it's better not to let other people in and just make the decision. But I do think better to have really 3 or 4 wise people in the congregation to work through something with you and not feel like you must make the decision yourself. I feel like that's when pastors do get in trouble. All right, chapter 25, the parson punishing. He just says, like, if you must punish somebody because there's really something wrong, do that fairly, but then don't avoid, he says, not avoiding his company or doing anything of averseness save in the very act of punishment. In other words, you almost say to the person, look, we have to do this. We have to remove you from the committee because of what's happened here. You can't lead worship because of what's happened here. But I just want you, I'm going to interact with you warmly. I'm glad to be, that's the one thing we've decided is the consequence. But otherwise, I still want to be in relationship and talk with you and be warm with you rather than sort of treat them coldly from then on. Like as if that's part of the punishment, that you're going to kind of withhold relationship. He says, don't do that. Just do what you have to do, but then otherwise be warm with the person. All right, chapter 26, the parson's eye. He just says here that it's really subtle. Money issues are really subtle, and congregation members and pastors as well need to think about the lines. So, for example, a man storing up money for his necessary provisions is fine, but he hardly perceives when his storing becomes greedy. So in other words, like, oh yeah, I'm saving, I'm just, to be frugal and I'm saving money, but then that can become a person who's got this massive lump sum of money that they keep saving, and it's, kind of ugly, actually. They're not generous. They're obsessed with it. So it goes from being prudent, smart, wise, to being, kind of an ugly thing. So similarly, if God has given me servants and I either provide too little for them or that which is unwholesome, I'm covetous, I'm greedy. So if people are under you, they're dependent on you, you should be generous or fair with them. That's a sign of greed if you're kind of being, withholding what you could do for somebody who works for you and not treating them fairly. If a man hath wherewithal to buy a spade, buy a shovel, and yet chooseth rather to use his neighbor's and wear out that, he is covetous. So again, like somebody who just like, it's good to borrow things. I mean, this is a really good example, like borrow some, people's rakes, and because you don't use it that often. Sometimes we do even still talk about, hey, you should just share with your neighbor some tools and yard stuff because not everybody needs all this stuff all the time. But if you're kind of like into that, like you're like the super borrower from everybody and you're wearing out other people's and you could actually afford to buy something, that's greedy. You're being stingy there. So anyway, there's just a fine line. I just thought that was wise and interesting. I hadn't really thought about that there are some people who are, they're always borrowing stuff, but it's off-putting because they end up wearing out stuff. I don't know. I was just thinking about that with tents and stuff like that. That's another thing. And people borrow in camping equipment because you don't use it all the time and you don't use it the same weekends as other people use it. It's just like, but if, you really could afford it and you're actually using it more than the actual person who you're borrowing it from, it's time maybe to just buy your own stuff. All right. The pastor in mirth is just an interesting line in chapter 27. The country parson is generally sad. That's the first line of this chapter because of the state of the world. And I sometimes see that with people online. And I think there's something to that. That when we read the newspaper, when we look at the world, the country parson is generally sad. And in the chapter, he goes on to say it's okay to have some other things to break the sadness in your life. But I just think it's a profound point that the prophets in the Old Testament were kind of downers and sad sometimes. And for people who do feel the pain of this world and the self-destructiveness, that's somewhat normal to be sad. All right. I don't think you'll find Herbert sad all the time. I think he's witty and fun, but enjoys the objects and the physical parts of life. But I think this is a good insight, and it may make some people feel better who think, am I depressed or am I just really in touch with the pain of this world? All right. Chapter 28, the pastor in contempt. He just says, pastors are not always liked, for whatever reason. Just because your profession reminds people of stuff or people have baggage about church or about priests or pastors. But then he goes on to just say, hey, you should still, nevertheless, the pastor endeavors that none shall despise. I mean, basically do your part. If they hate you because of Jesus, well then, okay. But if they hate you because you're a jerk, that's not good. And so similarly, you should live your life in a way and be kind and warm with people so that, it pours burning coals on their head. They don't want to dislike you. They actually like you despite themselves. They come around. Chapter 31, the parson in liberty. For the pious minds which are so tender and delicate, who worry about missing a Christian practice, they're perplexed and troubled, then the pastor can reassure the person. So anyway, there are just some people who are so religious and so like sensitive and want to do the right thing. And then, like he mentions, they oversleep, and then they're really upset that they missed their devotions or whatever, or they missed church or something like that. He can reassure them to some extent, but he says don't reassure them, who don't have good excuses, who are hard-hearted or whatever, and those are probably not the people you should reassure. So that's just a nuanced kind of thing. The parson surveys, chapter 32. He says the great and national sin of this land, the parson esteems to be idleness. He first represents to everybody the necessity of vocation. And basically what George Herbert says is that the pastor wants to help people find their calling, and find good jobs and find meaning in their life. And so he lists actually in this chapter all kinds of things that people can do with their life that are profitable. But he just feels like when people don't have that, they get themselves in sin and gambling and drinking and all sorts of bad habits. And so that's part of what you're doing, is actually trying to help people find meaning and meaningful work. And find meaning in raising kids as well. He talks about that and how that's a really good use of your time, is spending time influencing your kids. And the Parsons Library, this is great. The country Parsons Library is a holy life itself, is a sermon. And he's basically talking about like, hey, observe the challenges of your life, work through them, and then you can share with people how you've done it. So he says he first preaches to himself and then to others. He works through ideas, tries to apply it, and then he can share with others what he's learned. The parson's dexterity in applying of remedies, chapter 34. And this, he's talking about, you may have heard, disturb the comfortable, comfort the disturbed, sort of that. Disturb the comfortable. Those that he finds in a peaceable state, he adviseth to be very vigilant. So those who are like relaxed and chill and nothing bothering them, everything's fine. And he worries them that they may not be paying attention to things as carefully as they should be. And then those who are atheists, he says you will need to help them find hope by showing them the reasonableness and the goodness of the Christian faith. So he does a little bit of kind of apologetics, and then also just saying, you need to learn how to depict the goodness of God as well. So he says, again, you're going to want to work with atheists. He says, without opposing directly, for disputation is no surety for no sure solution for atheism, or something like that. So basically he's saying, like, arguing with the atheists, in a really direct, argumentative way, that's really not going to help the atheists. So you got to find kind of good arguments and sort of see where they're at, actually. Chapter 35, the parson's condescending. This is really an interesting chapter. He says basically that, like, you should encourage social secular gatherings that are not Christian, because a lot of good can happen of them. And he talked about processions, which was something in his day. I wonder about anyway, what the equivalent would be today. But I'll just tell you what he says. He says, the country parson is a lover of old customs, if they be good and harmless, and the rather because country people are much addicted to them, so that to favor them therein is to win their hearts, and to oppose them therein is to deject them. All I thought about here is like, I don't know, like a monster truck event or something, where you have big trucks, or maybe an old car show, and the people of that neighborhood, it's like a tradition in that community, and they're into it. And like if you're poo-pooing that and you're kind of a grouch about that as a pastor, like it's not spiritual enough, the monster truck race or the old car show, um, you're just going to kind of put off people because they like it. And so if you kind of get into it with them and participate, you're going to win their hearts. And if it's harmless, um, do it. It's okay. And then he also almost says like a lot of things where people have each other in their homes for different events that are positive or harmless. He says that should be encouraged. So he says, as knowing that absence breeds strangeness and presence love. Now love is the pastor's business and aim. Wherefore he likes well that his parish at good times invite one another to their houses, and he urges them to it. So people are having each other over, grilling out, I don't know, watching a game maybe. That's great. That's great. And it doesn't have to be always for spiritual reasons. And then he says, and if you've got somebody who you've kind of had, you're at odds with, there's some tension in your relationship with somebody, maybe you accept an invitation or you socialize with people. He says, quote, there is much preaching in this friendliness. So in other words, you've had in a meeting or at church or in some other, you've kind of had to talk to the person about a problem. There's some wounding, some sore feelings. Maybe you socialize with them and you watch a game with them, or go on a bike ride with them, or you go out for ice cream with them. You wouldn't normally, but it's good to lubricate the social relationships with some warmth. All right, chapter 36, the parson blessing. The country parson wonders that blessing the people is in so little use with his brethren. So most pastors don't do a lot with blessing people, but the country parson thinks it is only a grave and reverend, not only a grave and reverend thing, but beneficial also. So he's sort of trying to say, let's bring back blessing people. And he goes through the biblical passages in this chapter about blessing, Jesus blessing children. So the Levitical blessing. And he encourages pastors to adopt the practice. So it's just sort of interesting. He says, like, you could be superstitious about blessing holy water. He said that was not good when Roman Catholics did that before the Reformation or whatever. It got a little overdone, but some blessing maybe is something we should bring back and do. So I just thought that's an interesting, provocative idea from him. And 37 here, chapter 37, concerning detraction. The country parson, perceiving that most, when they are at leisure, make others' faults their entertainment and discourse. So what he's saying here is, he says, when people are kind of left alone and just chatting, they end up bad-mouthing other people. They gossip. They chat about the faults of other people. And when people are just hanging out, the main topic of conversation is other people and their faults. But he says, it's really interesting. He says, I'm not going to tell you necessarily not to do that. So he says, even some good men think so. They speak truth. They may disclose another's fault. So the parson finds it somewhat difficult how to proceed in this point. So he's actually flummoxed by this own point that he brings up. So Herbert doesn't quite know how to approach this. So he's almost thinking through it. He says, for if the parson absolutely shut up men's mouths and forbid disclosing a fault, many an evil may not only be, but also spread in his parish. So in other words, if I tell people no gossip, no saying anything, there are bad things that won't get unearthed. So he says, because infamy is part of the sentence against malefactors, so like people knowing about bad behavior, that's sort of one of the downsides of being doing things wrong. He says, and as malefactors may lose and forfeit their goods or life, so may their good name. So like they may get a sentence of some kind from the courts, have to pay a fine or, be in jail or something like that. They also forfeit their good name. That's also one of the consequences of bad behavior or crimes. So that is so far from being a faulty a fault to discover such offenders. That is a duty, rather, which may do much good and save much harm. So in other words, maybe a duty actually to raise issues. And I sometimes think about this where people are bullied by a pastor who's doing wrong to say no gossiping. Matthew 18. Go only to the person or something like that. First, the Matthew 18:15 that through 17, that whole thing, and they sort of say, you should never talk to somebody else about an issue or that kind of thing, and yet they're really telling the people that because they're doing wrong. So it's a way to cover up for what they're doing. And so I do think that he's right here to think in a nuanced way about gossip, really, and about I know Richard Lischer, for example, also says that in his book that Open Secret, that sometimes gossiping about something actually helps the community figure out how to address it. So anyway, it may not always be wrong, but I know like Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Life Together, he's totally against gossip, totally. So you'll have to think through that and weigh that. But I thought this was interesting and helpful and provocative.